For 40 long years, Daniel Hart lived a life that looked ordinary from the outside. Every morning at 6:30 a.m., his alarm rang. By 7:15, he was already dressed in his neatly pressed gray shirt, holding a worn leather briefcase that had been with him longer than most of his friendships. By 8:00, he would be sitting behind the same small desk at the city records office, quietly stamping documents and filing papers. Day after day, year after year, people often passed by his desk without even noticing him. Daniel wasn't the loud type. He didn't chase promotions, didn't argue, didn't complain. He simply worked carefully, honestly, reliably. But what most people never knew was that Daniel Hart carried a dream in his heart for nearly half a century. A small cafe, not a big restaurant, not a chain business, just a warm little cafe where people could sit, drink coffee, eat fresh pastries, and feel at home. He imagined wooden tables by a sunny window, the smell of fresh bread in the morning, soft music playing in the background, people laughing, talking, reading books, escaping the noise of the world. It was a simple dream, but life had other plans. When Daniel was 25, he got married. When he was 27, his son Michael was born. From that moment, his dream quietly stepped aside. Bills had to be paid, school fees had to be covered, life had to be stable, so Daniel worked harder. Overtime, extra shifts, holidays. Whenever he passed a cozy cafe on his way home, he would slow his steps just a little, looking through the window at the warm lights inside. Sometimes he whispered to himself, maybe one day. But years turned into decades. His wife passed away when Michael was 16. From that day on, Daniel became both father and mother to his son. He cooked dinner, helped with homework, worked longer hours to keep the house running, and still he never complained. Michael grew up strong, confident, and ambitious. Unlike his quiet father, Michael loved big things, expensive cars, modern offices, luxury lifestyles. He believed success meant money, status, and power, and Daniel was proud of him, even if they saw the world very differently. Then one quiet Friday afternoon, Daniel's boss walked into the office holding a small envelope. "Well, Daniel," the boss said with a smile, 40 years, that's something not many people can say. Inside the envelope was a simple letter. Retirement confirmation. Just like that, the routine of 4 decades came to an end. His co-workers clapped politely. Someone brought a small cake. They shook his hand and thanked him for his years of service. But when Daniel walked out of the building that evening, something strange happened. For the first time in 40 years, he felt free. The evening air felt lighter. The sky looked wider. And the quiet dream inside his heart slowly woke up again. That night, Daniel sat alone at the small kitchen table in his modest house. In front of him lay a notebook. He opened it carefully. Inside were pages filled with ideas he had written over the years. Coffee recipes, pastry ideas, cafe names, little sketches of table layouts. Dreams he had never shown anyone. He ran his fingers gently across the pages and smiled. "Maybe it's not too late," he whispered. For the first time in decades, Daniel allowed himself to imagine the dream again. A small cafe, warm lights, fresh coffee, friendly faces. The next morning, he called his son Michael. "Son," Daniel said over the phone, trying to hide the excitement in his voice. "Why don't you come by for dinner tonight? I want to tell you something." Michael arrived that evening wearing an expensive suit and checking messages on his phone. "Dad, I can only stay for an hour," he said quickly. "I've got meetings early tomorrow." "That's fine," Daniel replied with a gentle smile. They sat down at the dinner table. Daniel had cooked Michael's favorite meal, roasted chicken with garlic potatoes. For a few minutes they ate in silence. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "Well, I have some news." Michael looked up. "Yeah," Daniel's eyes sparkled with a quiet excitement that hadn't been there for years. "I've been thinking about what to do after retirement," he said. Michael nodded casually. Golf, fishing, travel. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, something else." He paused, gathering courage. "I want to open a cafe." For a moment, the room went completely silent. Michael stared at him. Then suddenly he laughed. Not a small chuckle, a loud, uncontrollable laugh. Daniel blinked in confusion. "You're serious?" Michael said between laughs. "Yes," Daniel replied softly. Michael leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Dad, you're 70 years old." 65, Daniel corrected gently. "That's not the point," Michael said. "Opening a business isn't some retirement hobby." Daniel remained calm. "I've been saving money for years. I found a small place downtown. It's perfect." Michael's smile disappeared, replaced with disbelief. "You're going to waste your retirement money on a cafe?" "It's not a waste," Daniel said quietly. "It's something I've always wanted." Michael scoffed. "Dad, be realistic." Daniel's hands slowly tightened around his fork. "I am being realistic." Michael leaned forward, his voice sharper now. "You've spent your entire life pushing papers in an office. You don't know anything about business." Daniel said nothing. Michael shrugged and delivered the words that would echo in Daniel's heart for weeks. "Face it, Dad." He smirked coldly. "You're a loser." The word hung in the air like a slap. "You'll never succeed." The room fell silent again. Daniel looked down at the table. For a moment his heart felt heavy. 40 years of quiet sacrifice. And this was how his dream sounded to his own son. But after a long pause, Daniel slowly lifted his head. His voice was calm, gentle, but firm. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess we'll see." Michael stood up, grabbing his coat. "Just don't come to me when you lose all your money," he muttered. The door closed behind him. Daniel sat alone at the dinner table. For a few minutes he didn't move. Then he stood up, walked to the kitchen drawer, and pulled out the small notebook again. He opened the first page. At the top, written in careful handwriting, were 3 words: "My Dream Cafe." Daniel looked at the page and smiled softly. "Too late," he whispered. He shook his head. "No." And that night, for the first time in his life, Daniel Hart began planning the future. Not as a tired office worker, but as a man who finally decided to chase his dream. The house felt unusually quiet after Michael left that night. The sound of the closing door echoed through the hallway, leaving Daniel standing alone beside the dinner table. The plates were still there, half-eaten food growing cold under the dim kitchen light. For a few moments, Daniel simply stood there. Michael's words replayed in his mind like a broken record. "You're a loser." "You'll never succeed." The words stung more than Daniel wanted to admit. Not because they came from a stranger, but because they came from his own son. Daniel slowly sat down again and looked around the small kitchen. Every corner of that house held memories of sacrifice. Late nights working overtime. Early mornings packing school lunches. Long evenings helping Michael with homework after exhausting days at the office. He had given his whole life to building stability for his son. And yet somehow the man Michael had become didn't see any of that. Daniel sighed softly. For a brief moment, doubt crept into his mind. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe opening a cafe at 65 was foolish. Maybe he was too old. Maybe he didn't understand business. Maybe his dream belonged in the past. Daniel rubbed his forehead and closed his eyes. But then another memory appeared in his mind. It was from 30 years earlier, a young Daniel walking home after work, stopping in front of a small cafe on the corner of Maple Street. He had stood there for several minutes, watching people laugh and talk inside, while the smell of fresh coffee drifted into the evening air. Back then he had whispered the same words to himself. Maybe one day. Daniel opened his eyes again. The dream had lived quietly inside him for decades, through sleepless nights, through hard years, through loss and loneliness. It had never disappeared, and now, when he finally had the chance to chase it, he was supposed to give up because someone laughed. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he murmured. He stood up, cleared the table, washed the dishes, and then returned to the kitchen with his small notebook. The same notebook that held years of forgotten ideas. He flipped through the pages carefully, handwritten coffee recipes. Sketches of wooden tables, ideas for pastries and sandwiches, possible names for the cafe. He stopped on one page that had a simple drawing of a cozy room with sunlight coming through large windows. Underneath the sketch were two words, second chance. Daniel smiled faintly. That's exactly what this is, he said to himself. A second chance, not just for a business, but for himself. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual. Old habits die hard. At 6:30 a.m. He was already sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his notebook open. But today was different. Today he wasn't preparing for another day of paperwork. Today he was planning something new. He grabbed a pen and wrote a list at the top of a fresh page. Asterisk, asterisk, things to do, asterisk, asterisk, find a location, check rental prices, research permits, buy equipment, create a menu. Daniel looked at the list and chuckled softly. 40 years in an office had made him very good at organizing things. All right, he said quietly, let's begin. The first week was harder than he expected. Opening a cafe wasn't just about brewing coffee. There were forms, permits, inspections, and endless paperwork. Ironically, Daniel found himself dealing with the same type of documents he had spent 4 decades filing for other people. But this time they mattered, because they were for his dream. He spent hours visiting different properties around the city. Some places were too expensive, others were too small. One location looked perfect, but had terrible parking. Still, Daniel refused to give up. Every rejection made him more determined. Every challenge pushed him forward. Because now he had something powerful driving him, not anger, not revenge, but proof that his son was wrong. 2 weeks later, Daniel found it, a small corner shop on a quiet street not far from the city park. The place had been empty for nearly a year. Dust covered the windows, and the paint on the walls had faded. Most people would have seen an abandoned space, but Daniel saw something else, possibility. He stepped inside slowly. Sunlight poured through the large front windows. The room was small but warm. He could already imagine the wooden tables. The smell of coffee, the soft music, people sitting by the windows reading books. Daniel walked to the center of the room and turned in a slow circle. Yes, he whispered, this is it. The following weeks became the busiest of Daniel's life. He cleaned. He painted. He repaired broken shelves. He installed warm lights above the tables. His hands, which had spent decades handling papers and pens, were suddenly covered in dust and paint. But every night when he locked the cafe door, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, pride, real pride. Sometimes the work was exhausting. Sometimes doubts returned late at night, when the cafe was quiet and unfinished. But every time Daniel thought about quitting, he remembered Michael's laughter. You're a loser. Daniel would shake his head and keep working. One evening, an elderly neighbor walking past the cafe stopped at the door. Are you opening a coffee shop here? The man asked. Daniel smiled. Yes, I am. The man stepped inside, looking around at the half-finished room. Well, he said kindly, this neighborhood could use something like that. Daniel felt warmth in his chest. Thank you. As the man left, Daniel looked around the room again. The cafe wasn't perfect yet. The walls still needed decoration. The menu wasn't finalized. The sign outside hadn't been installed. But the dream was no longer just words in a notebook. It was becoming real, slowly, brick by brick, step by step, and for the first time since Michael laughed at him, Daniel no longer felt hurt. He felt something much stronger. Determination, because somewhere deep inside his heart, Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. One day, very soon, the same people who laughed at him would walk through this door, and when they did, they would see exactly what a loser was capable of building. The grand opening of Daniel's Cafe happened on a quiet Monday morning. There were no balloons, no ribbon, cutting ceremony, no advertisements in newspapers. Just a small wooden sign hanging above the door that read, Asterisk, asterisk, Second Chance, Cafe, asterisk, asterisk, Daniel, had installed it himself the night before, carefully tightening every screw with trembling hands. At exactly 7:00 a.m., he unlocked the front door. The smell of freshly brewed coffee slowly filled the air. Warm light glowed from the hanging lamps above the wooden tables he had spent weeks sanding and polishing. Everything looked exactly the way he had imagined for decades. Simple, cozy, welcoming. Daniel stood behind the counter, wearing a clean white apron. His heart beat faster than it had in years. He checked the clock again, 7:10 a.m. The cafe was empty. He wiped the counter, checked the pastries, adjusted the chairs, then he waited. 7:30 a.m. Still no customers. Daniel forced himself to stay calm. First days are always slow. He whispered, but deep inside, a familiar doubt began creeping back. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe nobody would come. Maybe people preferred big cafes with modern designs and flashy menus. Daniel poured himself a small cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring at the quiet street. 7:47 a.m. The bell above the door suddenly rang. Daniel looked up. A middle-aged woman stepped inside, brushing cold morning air off her coat. "Good morning," she said politely. Daniel almost dropped the coffee pot. "Gee, good morning," he replied quickly. The woman looked around the cafe, taking in the warm lighting and wooden tables. "This place looks lovely," she said. Daniel felt his shoulders relax. "Thank you." She ordered a cappuccino and a blueberry muffin. Daniel prepared the drink carefully, his hands steady but his heart racing. When he placed the cup in front of her, she smiled. "Smells amazing." Daniel nodded gratefully. That first customer stayed for nearly 40 minutes, quietly reading a book while sipping her coffee. When she left, she stopped at the counter. "I'll definitely come back," she said. Daniel watched her walk out the door with a small smile on his face. One customer, it wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The next day, 2 customers came. The day after that, 4. By the end of the first week, a small group of regular visitors had already discovered the cafe. Most of them were people from the neighborhood. A retired teacher who liked reading by the window, a young couple who worked remotely on their laptops, a construction worker who stopped by every morning before his shift. Daniel learned their names. He remembered their favorite drinks. He greeted every single person with genuine warmth, because for Daniel, the cafe was never just about coffee. It was about people. Word slowly began spreading. "Have you tried the new cafe near the park? The owner is the nicest man. They have the best cinnamon rolls." Customers started bringing friends. Friends brought coworkers. Soon the cafe that had opened quietly without attention began filling with life. The soft sound of conversation filled the room. Laughter echoed between the walls. The smell of fresh pastries drifted through the street every morning. And Daniel worked harder than he ever had in his entire life. But this time it didn't feel like work. It felt like living. 3 months passed. Second Chance Cafe had become one of the most loved spots in the neighborhood. On weekend mornings, people sometimes waited outside for tables. Local students came to study. Families came for breakfast. Even office workers from downtown started stopping by on their way to work. One afternoon, a young woman approached Daniel at the counter. "Are you the owner?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel replied. "I write for a local blog about small businesses." She said, "Would you mind if I featured your cafe?" Daniel blinked in surprise. "You want to write about this place?" She smiled. "Everyone in this area is talking about it." A week later, the article was published online. ***, a Second Chance Cafe, the heart of the neighborhood. ***, the story spread quickly on social media. More customers arrived. More people shared photos of the cozy cafe. And suddenly, the small dream Daniel had carried for 40 years had become something much bigger. Something alive. One Friday afternoon, Daniel stepped outside to take a short break. The cafe inside was full. Every table was occupied. People were laughing, drinking coffee, enjoying the warm atmosphere he had created. Daniel leaned against the wall and looked at the sign above the door. Second Chance Cafe. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He remembered the night Michael had laughed at him. "You're a loser." Daniel opened his eyes and looked through the window at the happy customers inside. A small smile appeared on his face, not a proud smile, not a revengeful one, just a quiet smile of satisfaction. Because success, he realized, wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about proving to yourself that your dream was worth chasing. But life had a strange way of bringing things full circle, and Daniel had no idea that the next chapter of this story was about to walk through the door. 3 days later, on a cold Monday morning, the bell above the cafe door rang again. Daniel looked up from the counter. And froze. Standing in the doorway was his son, Michael, but he looked very different. The expensive suit was gone. The confident posture had disappeared, his eyes looked tired, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than Daniel had ever heard it before. "Dad," Michael said slowly, "can we talk?" The cafe was full that morning. The soft hum of conversation filled the room as customers laughed, sipped coffee, and enjoyed the warm atmosphere of second chance cafe. Plates clinked, the espresso machine hissed, and sunlight poured through the wide front windows. Daniel stood behind the counter, preparing a latte, when the bell above the door rang. He looked up, and there he was, Michael. For a moment, Daniel almost didn't recognize his own son. The expensive suits were gone. The confident smile had disappeared. His hair looked messy, and his eyes were tired, as if he hadn't slept well for weeks. Michael stepped inside slowly, glancing around the busy cafe. Every table was full. Customers were laughing. Waitresses moved quickly between tables carrying fresh pastries and coffee. The warm smell of cinnamon rolls filled the air. Michael stared at everything in silence. It was clear he hadn't expected this. Finally, his eyes landed on Daniel behind the counter. "Dad," he said quietly. Daniel placed the latte on the counter for a customer and wiped his hands on his apron. "Yes." Michael hesitated. "Can we talk?" Daniel looked at the cafe around them. People were waiting for their drinks, and 2 customers had just walked in. "I'm a little busy right now," Daniel said calmly, "but you can sit at the corner table." Michael nodded and slowly walked to a small table near the window. For the next 20 minutes he sat there silently watching the cafe, watching customers greet Daniel warmly, watching people thank him for the coffee, watching strangers treat his father with respect, something Michael had never really done himself. When the rush finally slowed, Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them to the table. He sat down across from his son. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Michael took a deep breath. "I lost my job," he said. Daniel didn't react. Michael looked down at his hands. "The company downsized last month. I thought I'd find another job quickly, but it hasn't worked out." Daniel listened quietly. Michael continued, "My savings are almost gone. Rent is due next week." His voice sounded smaller than Daniel had ever heard before. Then Michael finally looked up. "Dad, I need help." Daniel waited. Michael swallowed his pride. "I was wondering if maybe I could work here." The words came out slowly. "As a waiter?" For a long moment, Daniel simply looked at him. This was the same son who had laughed at him. The same son who had called him a loser. The same son who said he would never succeed. And now that son sat across from him, asking for a job. The cafe was quiet around them. Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee. Then he looked directly into Michael's eyes, and calmly said the 2 words Michael never expected to hear. "No." Michael blinked in shock. "No," he repeated. Daniel set his cup down gently. "No." Michael's face flushed with embarrassment. "Dad, please," he said quickly. "I know I said some things before. I was wrong. I admit that." Daniel remained calm. "Do you remember exactly what you said?" he asked. Michael's shoulders sank. "Yes, you laughed at me." Daniel continued. "You said I was a loser." Michael nodded slowly. "I know, and I regret it." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "For 40 years, he said softly, I worked a job I didn't love so you could have opportunities I never had." Michael looked down again. "I know. I sacrificed my dreams because raising you mattered more." Silence filled the space between them. Daniel's voice remained steady, but there was emotion behind it. "When I finally decided to follow my dream, the person whose support meant the most to me laughed." Michael's eyes filled with guilt. "I'm sorry, Dad." Daniel studied his son for a moment. Then he stood up. I meant what I said, Daniel repeated. You can't work here, Michael nodded slowly. He stood up from the table, clearly defeated. I understand, he said quietly. He reached for his jacket. I guess I deserve that. Michael turned toward the door, but just before he reached it, Daniel spoke again. Michael stopped and turned around. Yes. Daniel crossed his arms and looked at him carefully. I said you can't work here as a waiter. Michael frowned slightly. What do you mean? Daniel walked closer and gestured toward the busy cafe. You see those waiters? Michael nodded. They work incredibly hard. Daniel said they respect people. They treat customers kindly. They don't think they're better than anyone else. Michael listened quietly. Daniel continued, and right now you're not ready for that. Michael looked confused. Then why did you stop me? Daniel smiled slightly. Because if you're going to work here, he said, you're going to start where everyone else starts. Michael blinked. Which is? Daniel pointed toward the back door of the cafe, the kitchen. Michael looked surprised. The kitchen, Daniel nodded. You'll wash dishes, clean floors, take out trash. Michael stared at him. No shortcuts, Daniel said. No special treatment. Michael hesitated. Why? Daniel's voice softened. Because success doesn't come from a fancy office or a big salary. He gestured around the cafe. It comes from respect, hard work, and humility. Michael looked around the cafe again. The smiling customers, the warm atmosphere, the life his father had built. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll do it. Daniel extended his hand. Then, welcome to Second Chance Cafe. Michael shook his father's hand. For the first time in his life, he understood something important. The sweetest revenge his father could have chosen was not anger, not humiliation, not rejection. It was something far more powerful, a lesson. And as Michael walked into the kitchen to start his first shift washing dishes, Daniel returned to the counter, greeted a new customer with a warm smile, and poured another cup of coffee. Because sometimes the greatest success in life isn't proving someone wrong. It's showing them how to become better.